President Trump signed an executive order that shifts responsibility for disaster preparations to state and local governments. The Government Accountability Office added disaster response to its high-risk list this year. They have more than 60 recommendations to improve the process, and individuals applying for assistance face a forest of complexity when they need simplicity most. To find out where progress is being made and where more can be done, Federal News Network's Terry Gerton spoke with the director of GAO's Homeland Security and Justice Division, Chris Currie.
Chris, thanks so much for sharing some time with me this morning. Now, the number of disasters and the size of the damage from those disasters has been growing every year. So, what prompted GAO to put federal disaster response on the high risk list this year?
Yeah, this has been a long time coming, actually. Over the last 10 years, the federal government spent about $500 billion on disaster assistance. So you're correct that the number has been going up, the costs have been going up. But really, the main thing we're seeing is that the complexity of these programs is making it very difficult for state and local officials and individuals themselves to recover. It's just become way too big and difficult and is in need of major streamlining and reform.
So, you talked about the complexity of this. There's over 30 federal agencies that have a role in federal disaster response. I guess the big ones are FEMA, Housing Urban Development, and the Small Business Administration. But there's a lot more that play a role in that. So, GAO's made some recommendations about simplification. What recommendations do you think have the most potential or promise?
So, yeah, to understand this issue, you really have to put yourself in the role of a state or local official. So if you have a disaster and you've got all this damaged infrastructure, roads, bridges, power systems, water systems, and you have to figure out which programs you're going to use to try to rebuild which systems. And, for example, let me just start with roads. Department of Transportation, FEMA, HUD, other agencies all provide funding that could be used to repair roads, bridges, things you need to get like society back and running in your community. They're all different. They have different timeframes. They have different rules and regulations. They have different environmental processes. And some of these reviews take years. And so if you're a local official that's not used to dealing with this scale of an effort, you're trying to figure out how to use these individually and then together. And it's just extremely difficult. And look, nobody designed this system to make it difficult. These programs were all intended to help people, but they just weren't designed to work in concert together for a recovery. And so, over years of doing this kind of work and traveling all around the country to different locations, we hear consistently from state and local officials that these programs, they appreciate them, but they are just too complicated.
Well, doesn't FEMA play sort of the role of quarterback in coordinating all of the different agency responses? I mean, they're often the first people on the ground and they provide some guidance, but how is FEMA doing on the recommendations that you've made to help
Yeah.
them streamline this really complicated process?
This is the part that a lot of people don't understand. So FEMA does play that coordinator role, and it's really clear in the response phase. So leading up to like a hurricane, the immediate response, and then the weeks after where you're trying to save property, remove debris, things like that. And for the most part, that system works pretty well. And that's what we hear from state and local officials. The challenge comes when recovery and rebuilding starts. That's where FEMA's role is a lot less clear. And frankly, the role of the different levels of government is a lot less clear. So one of the things that we've recommended for years is that individual agencies like FEMA and HUD and SBA, that they take action to streamline and make their processes simpler. For example, there are different processes and registration systems and websites if you're a state and local official to upload projects to different agencies. We think that one option is that you could combine these and consolidate these into one unified federal system. And, just low-hanging fruit like that. We've also laid out other options over the years to consolidate some of these programs, possibly eliminate certain agencies, which is being looked at right now, and a number of other options. The reason we added improving the delivery of federal disaster assistance this year to the high-risk list, though, is that for years, the agencies have just not been able to make progress on their own. And that's just why we've elevated this to Congress, that, hey, now it's time for somebody else to look at this across the board and figure out how we can fix these issues.
So You actually have 4 recommendations for or matters of consideration for Congress. I'll get my terminology
Mhm.
correct. One of those being establishment of a congressional commission. How would that help the process?
So remember, we made this recommendation 2 years ago before all these recent talks of reorganization and eliminating FEMA came about. But there are over 30 congressional committees of jurisdiction with oversight over DHS and disaster assistance at large. And this is actually part of the issue is that in order to reform the whole system, you have to have all these committees working together to address this problem because a lot of these require legislative fixes. And, so we thought in prior cases where you had a national level problem, a commission has been helpful to sort of rise above all those areas of jurisdiction and provide acceptable recommendations and legislative proposals to address big problems. So that's why we went there on this one.
Do you think the time is right? Will there be enough congressional attention to get something like that off the ground?
Well, there has been some effort in Congress in both the last Congress and the current Congress to develop something like that. I think the question right now is whether something like that is going to react quick enough to provide options before the administration takes action, which it seems like it's trying to do pretty quickly.
Well, speaking of administration action, there's a new Trump executive order that shifts more responsibility for planning and response in disasters to state and local governments and seems to take responsibility from FEMA. But you've made responsibilities that FEMA actually needs to get bigger, that they need to add people to this to build this capacity. So where's the happy medium there?
Yeah, I think the frustration with FEMA comes from what I was talking about with the long, drawn out bureaucratic recovery programs. That's where people really get frustrated. Hurricane Katrina, I tell people, is still an open disaster, meaning there are still dollars being obligated and paid from FEMA to Louisiana and Mississippi. That's how long some of these big catastrophic disasters can stay open. So it's a huge problem that needs to be fixed and looked at as a whole to try to address some of these issues. I think the recent discussions about changing FEMA or eliminating FEMA, I think, get to some of those frustrations. Whether you rename the agency, whether you move responsibilities, whether you move it out of DHS, I mean, there's all sorts of things being discussed. But my concern is that we're going to do some of those things and not fix some of these root problems, because at the end of the day, the federal government is going to be providing aid to state and local governments after disaster. And the big problem is the way that aid's administered right now is not efficient and it's not working effectively. So we still have to address the root causes of that problem.
And do states really have the capacity to do this on their own, to do disaster response sort of within their available resources?
That is a great question, and that is one of the most important things we're going to have to make sure not to break if we change this system. So some states and localities absolutely have the experience and the capacity to address this. So you think cities like Houston and states like Florida and places that have had so many disasters over the year, and they have tons of capacity and experience. They can manage billions of dollars in recovery. Other places just do not. We hear around the country, tribal governments, rural governments, small states, they don't have the capacity to absorb the dollars and be able to manage them effectively. And that's where the federal government does come in and help. FEMA provides a lot of technical assistance after a disaster. And so if we're going to shift responsibilities to the states, we're going to have to make sure that that capacity is built in. And I think one of the things that is going to need to happen if that occurs is this is going to have to be phased in order to let the states prepare and then manage more of this on their own. They can't just do this overnight.
Chris Currie is director of GAO's Homeland Security and Justice Division, speaking there with Federal News Network's Terry Gerton. As always, you can find this interview as well as a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.